There have been many revolutions written in the history of mankind, revolutions ending in many fatalities by the use of guns and swords, by the use of brutal violence and inhumane onslaughts. Revolutions drenched in the blood of the fallen and the tears of the lost. Many a time, man refused to realize that, in his battles, his only enemy was his own kind. However, there were times when man stood up against these horrid acts and recognized that these wars could shed no blood, could shed no tears. Ironically, this rare occasion occurred in one of man's most dreadful of times and to one of man's most forgotten places. The country of Estonia, abandoned by the world and left to fend for themselves, faced with hostility and force, only to triumph over their Soviet oppressors, not by mirroring their violence, but by retaliating in harmony with their citizens' united voices. Together as one, Estonia showed to the world another remedy to lead war into a peaceful compromise. The fated year dated 1940. Estonia had been deemed an independent country since their previous freedom from the Soviet Union on February 24, 1918. But all of that changed when World War II gazed its harrowing eyes on Europe. Only 1 year earlier, on August 23rd, was the freedom of Estonia and the other Baltic states signed away by Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Through this pact, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had formed an alliance and had divided Europe amongst the two countries. On September 24, 1940, Stalin threatened to invade and occupy Estonia if it did not permit the Soviet Union to construct military bases on their land, going as far as baiting the frightened country by promising to acknowledge their sovereignty. Even when Estonia apprehensively complied, the Soviets took over the Estonian government in June of 1940 regardless. The Soviet Union had broken their promise, marking the beginning of a merciless period of Soviet oppression upon the Estonians. Almost immediately, Soviet soldiers began filing through the streets of Estonia. Bases and camps were built in areas once occupied by former residents. New laws were implemented by the USSR in order to force Soviet culture onto the natives. The laws were accentuated to the point where Estonian culture as a whole was forbidden to the citizens. Estonians were required to learn and speak the Russian language at schools and celebrate Soviet traditions during the years of their occupation. Estonians were even banned from many of their traditional customs, such as owning Estonian flags, singing patriotic Estonian songs, and educating others about Estonian culture. Future generations of Estonians over the following years lacked in knowledge of their country's history as a result of this dilemma. However, those who chose to defy the given restrictions were at a risk for heavy consequences. Punishments ranged from years of imprisonment to deportation, even going as far as public executions. Some Estonians, fearing the idea of being subdued, were forced to escape their country to a safer place. These factors and more caused the country to lose as much as 25% of its population over the first 6 years of harsh occupation.
Estonian people. This language is spoken by 1 million people, but 900,000 live here. 100,000 of Estonians live out of our country. They escaped during the Second World War time, and now even until Australia. There are Estonians in Canada, in America, in Sweden. There are 30,000 Estonians.
With that, the Soviet Union had deliberately created a cultural genocide against Estonia and the Baltic states. Many of the other nations were too occupied with the assaults of Hitler and the conflicts of World War II to be involved with the state's unfair occupation. The weakened husks of the countries were left to fend for themselves through these dark times. The Baltic states had found themselves in the most stressful of situations. Hope for their country's prosperity remained foggy and despondent. But the Estonians, enraged of their previous independence being stripped away from them, decided to fight back the occupying Soviets. However, instead of using weapons and warfare to drive the oppressors away, they chose to fight back using peaceful, yet powerful and patriotic defenses: their voices. Thus, the powerful and inspiring singing revolution had begun to spur its first notes. Customarily, Estonians had held singing festivals, or laulupidu, every 4 to 6 years to honor their culture. Unfortunately, this all changed when the Soviets occupied the Baltic states, and performing Estonian choirs were required to sing patriotic Russian melodies instead. In 1947, during the first Lalupidu under Soviet rule, a man named Gustav Ernesaks wrote a tune set to the lyrics of a century-old national poem written by Lydia Koidula, dubbed Muizama on Minu Arm, translated as Land of My Fathers, Land That I Love. This song became the unofficial national anthem for the Estonians during the festivals that expressed their desires of freedom from their occupation. As the Soviets began to catch on to the Estonians' true intentions, they banned the song from future festivals in an attempt to quell the actions of the revolution. However, their attempts had failed, as the Estonians kept singing the song defiantly. On the 100th anniversary of Lalupidu, over 100,000 Estonians on the stage and in the audience sang the anthem with no regard to the Soviet Union's threats. Soviet authorities were forced to allow the attenders to have an encore of their performance due to the Estonians' bold actions.
The young people just decided to gather, raise Estonian national flags and sing the songs which were not allowed to sing in the Soviet time because national symbols were prohibited. It was enough when you sang Estonian national anthem, the real anthem, and to go to the Siberia.
Although singing was one of the key tactics used by the Estonians to peacefully protest against Soviet occupation, other passive actions were taken to retaliate as well. These methods significantly began to skyrocket when President Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. This was the time that Estonians began to test the limitations of their freedom of speech, taking this chance to form political groups such as the Estonian Popular Front, the Estonian National Independence Party, and the National Heritage Society. Everyday citizens took part in the protests as well, holding marches in their hometowns with signs that read, "I am Estonian" and "My fatherland is my grace." All of these actions eventually led to the creation of the Declaration of Independence of Estonia, which was written on November 16, 1988. This was the most extreme expression of independence that the Estonians could have presented to the Soviets, and they had managed to go above and beyond the Soviets' expectations, shocking them with their potential. Nevertheless, 3 years later in August of 1991, Estonia's patriotism would be put to the ultimate test. The Soviet Union staged a coup with Moscow in Estonia in order to quell the fight for independence. Tanks and hundreds of Moscow troops invaded the cities of Estonia with the intention of destroying their broadcasting towers, dealing with any who resisted and stood in their way. But this did not stop the Estonians. They began to take action, barricading their radio towers and TV stations with their bodies and forming huge protesting chains to slow down the troops. Patriotic Estonian songs erupted from these formations as they stood defiantly before the advancing forces. The soldiers were rendered puzzled to their next course of action, as their opponents refused to shed a single drop of Soviet blood onto their soil. This immediately led to a big meeting with the Supreme Council of Estonia, the Estonian Committee, and the Soviet government officials. The Soviet government had proposed that they would retreat their military bases and hand over their control over the Estonian government if they were allowed to flee peacefully and with no harmed soldiers. The Estonian government was aware that this was their chance, at the Soviet Union's weakest point, to grab hold of the situation and ambush the army to end the empire there and then. They knew that they could have ended the fight with this chance. They could prevent many future deaths and losses in this everlasting hell of a legacy of the Second World War, for the Baltic states, and even for the world. But, despite the life-changing opportunity, Estonia compromised and let the Soviet militaries withdraw without a scratch, eventually watching them slowly crumble and collapse without firm military support, finally putting an end to the Soviet Union. At long last, Estonia had rid their country of their ferocious occupiers and allowed the Estonians to be residents of an independent country for the first time in over 50 long years. As time passed, Estonia began to flourish. Because of the peaceful acts took during the occupation, the country's people prevented many future interethnic interventions. Eventually, Estonia established a strong democratic form of government, and finally, the world began to recognize Estonia as their own independent country. Truly, the singing revolution was a unique and powerful movement that many refer to as a weaponless fight. It stands true to the fact that conflict can be resolved without violence, and compromises can be reached peacefully despite the costs. That rebellion did not always have to begin in bloodshed and end in death. Some revolutions were formed by aberrance. Some were amalgamated by revenge. Others just had the goal of proving a point. But there will always be one that shined through the darkness of hatred, one that sought to unite the abandoned, one that seeded a blossom of hope and liberation, one that needed no weapon, that needed no bloodshed to obtain victory. A nation, a dream, a harmony, a song.